We're in New York City, so how about if we stand and welcome Ralph to New York City, and let's show him we're a bit excited about this campaign. About it. We want Ralph. 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 All right, here we go, Ralph.
Warm welcome. Thank you. Thank you. Now I know I'm in New York. Thank you, Carl. And before I get into my remarks, I just want to note that I read, as you did, in the New York Times very recently, that the New York Yankees, who I adored when I was a young child, largely because of the example of Lou Gehrig and his stamina. New York Yankees won another $300 million in tax-free bonds to support the new stadium. It's not enough that 20 acres of parkland were taken, trees were cut down, the old stadium wasn't renovated. It's not enough that they've already received taxpayer subsidies for entertainment, which I don't think taxes should be used for. And at the same time, I just got another review of the physical structure of New York City public schools and the clinics and the libraries and the need for rebuilding the bridges and highways and the public transit, modernizing a lot of the public works and under the roads, the sewage treatment plants, and drinking water purification plants. But there's not enough money for these necessities, but there's enough money for the New York Yankees and George Steinbrenner. There's enough money to blow apart Iraq, a country never threatened us. $14 million an hour, 24 hours a day, is what it's costing us, and that doesn't count the veterans' support for years and years for the injured and the sick. And, you know, just reading the New York Times and other newspapers, the information is available. We know what's wrong in one area after another. We also have a pretty good sense that we have solutions all over the place, whether it's for energy, for tax reform, for health insurance, for affordable housing. We have solutions on how to make government accountable. We have solutions on how to crack down on corporate crime, fraud, abuse. It's looting pensions and draining investors, the whole Wall Street crookery, all the way down to Enron in Houston. You know what's missing? What's missing here? What's the missing ingredient? It's us. We're the missing ingredient. There is no way this country can be driven into the ground as it's being driven by giant multinational corporations who've hijacked our government, who were born in the USA and grew to profit on the backs of American workers, who when they were in trouble went to Washington to be bailed out by American taxpayers, who when they were in trouble overseas called on the US Marines. And then they come back here, and what's their message to the American people? We're out of here with your jobs and industry to fascist and communist dictatorships abroad who know how to keep workers in their place. It's time that we take a political campaign and merge it into a civic action campaign before November 4th and after November 4th, which is why we call the Nader-Gonzalez campaign an 08-09. Now, I know what it takes to make effective change in terms of hours by citizens and how many it takes and the kind of strategies. When I hitchhiked from Connecticut through to New York to Washington, D.C. in 1963 and 64, a few years out of law school. I was picked up by a truck driver in Delaware, and I was on the highway like this, picked me up, and he said to me, where are you going? I said, I'm going to Washington, D.C. He said, to do what? I said, to bring General Motors under federal regulation. I thought, he gave me a strange look. I thought he was going to let me off on the side of the road. Now, those were the days when I believed, and this is the real American dream. This is an economic accumulation. The real American dream is justice. Equal justice under law, due process, probable cause, access to justice. I believed if you went down to Washington and you had the goods on the auto companies suppressing long developed safety devices like seatbelts, airbags, padded dash panels. That one was created by the Roman chariot manufacturers 2,000 years ago. Plenty of lead time for GM. Stronger door latches, rollover strength, side protection, head restraints, collapsing steering columns, non-shattered glass, all the things that we now take for granted. That if you place this before the members of Congress, in the key committees, for the key chairs, things would start to happen. And they did start to happen. And from the first hearing in April of '65 until September '65, that's what it took to bring one of the largest industries in the country under federal safety and fuel efficiency regulation, signed by Lyndon Johnson in September at the White House. I then said to myself, well, this is really good. So I went into gas pipeline safety, flammable fabric safety, went into air and water pollution laws, the occupational safety laws, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Freedom of Information Act, the great Freedom of Information Act of 1974. All kinds of legislation, and so that there was a firmament in the government that was supposed to stand for the people, their health, safety, rights, economic well-being. And this was possible because that the people were out in the streets in the '60s. They showed up. They showed up at marches, showed up at rallies. It was anti-war, it was civil rights, it was women's rights, it was environmental, Earth Day, 1970. The second reason is there were key members of committees in Congress who actually had their finger to the wind. And they began representing people for a change instead of corporations. So they had hearings. The third was there were enough reporters for the Washington Post, AP, UPI, New York Times, Baltimore Sun, that reported all these things day by day. They weren't just reporting for the Pulitzer Prize in one big feature on page 1. They actually kept tabs at which senator was under influence, which House member was courageous. I would get information to Drew Pearson, who was a very powerful columnist at that time, syndicated around the country. And third, we had two presidents that signed these bills with flourishing statements. One was Lyndon Johnson, and the other was Richard Nixon. Now, why would Richard Nixon sign into law almost anything we got through Congress? OSHA, EPA, the great framing air and water pollution laws, the Product Safety Commission laws. Why? Because he heard the rumble from the people coming out of the '60s. Because he was the last Republican to fear Democratic liberals. Because he felt that it was the better side of valor politically to do so. And so how much civic energy was involved here? I mean, we brought the coal industry under health and safety regulation in the late '60s and around the early '70s. And we also got billions of dollars to widows and orphans in Appalachia to compensate them for the deaths of their husbands, minors, for black lung disease. And there were 3 of us in Washington working the Congress and the media, 2 doctors in Appalachia going in and out of the hollows, educating the miners who were told that their lung disease was due to smoking and alcohol instead of black lung disease, the fine coal dust that they ingested every day. You know how they come out of work every day, right? And a couple newspapers in Appalachia, Charleston Gazette, and that framework of a few key people in Congress and a president who had signed. What else was it? There was a residual fear of popular anger. There is a residual fear that the country could erupt again, not just during civil rights, not just anti-war, that it could erupt again. Now, when you consider how many millions of hours people spend in bridge club activity, in bird watching activity, in bowling league activity, hardly a fraction of those hours got all this through. And that's what I want to convey here tonight. 1 out of every 200 adult Americans organized with each other in every congressional district. That's 2,000. That's roughly 4,000 people in each congressional district that has 630,000 people. Let's cut it in half. Let's say 2,000. Willing to give 500 hours a year, volunteer time, and to raise a minimum of a couple $100 each a year, could produce full-time staff and offices in every congressional district. And then reflecting popular sentiment, which is really our agenda. Our agenda has item after item supported by the majority of the people. Single-payer health care, for example, is an example. Cracking down on corporate crime, fraud and abuse, so on. Could turn Congress around. You turn Congress around, you turn the executive around. Because Congress is the most powerful branch in Congress, under the Constitution. Got the money, for one thing. You turn the executive around, you've got the federal government over time with judicial appointments, and it affects your state government in Albany. You know how many hours are involved in that? Well, I just calculated how many hours are involved watching the Super Bowl. Assuming it's pre, during, and right after the Super Bowl, it's 5 hours. 500 million hours watching the Super Bowl. We have 500 million hours organized watching Congress. Cannot believe the change. We grow up feeling powerless. We grow up told you can't fight City Hall or Exxon, forget it. Just live your private lives. Enjoy your personal freedoms. And we grow up not even asking, how long are our personal freedoms going to be enjoyable if we don't have civic freedom? If we don't have freedom to shape foreign military policy, domestic policy, the quality of our elections, the accountability of our politicians, the responsibility of corporations. If we don't have the civic freedom to shape that under the sovereignty of the people, remember the phrase, we the people starts the Constitution, not we the corporations. If we don't have that, our personal freedom is going to mean less and less. And that's the distinction we don't make when we say, oh, this is a free country. What does it mean when we say, oh, this is a free country? What it means is that we can work where we want, buy what we want, travel where we want, marry who we want, play where we want. That's personal freedom. And we have probably more of it than any place around, given the entertainment industry. However, in dictatorships, there's a lot of personal freedom. I was in the Soviet Union once, and I said, everything must be completely, straitjacketed. And I was walking down the street in Moscow, and a guy came up and started talking in broken English. I said, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm going to the Caucasus to hunt. I said, this is Khrushchev time. What are you doing going to the Caucasus? He says, do you know anything about our country? Yeah, what do you think it is? I mean, as long as we stay out of politics, we can do pretty much what we want, and we do a good job of getting drunk. So we have to make that distinction, personal freedom and civic freedom, so we don't define freedom in personal terms only, which is what the corporate marketing gurus want us to do. Civic freedom means participation in power, and that's what Marcus Cicero defined freedom as participation in power. See how fundamental that definition is when we ask ourselves, do we have that kind of freedom? We have a two-party elected dictatorship. It's turned the government over to big business for its self-perpetuation. It sold the federal government for $4 or $5 billion an election. Pretty good bargain. This two-party elected dictatorship, because it's a winner-take-all, because there's an electoral college where a person who comes in second in a popular vote can win the presidency. Try selling that one to Western Europe and Canada. Because of that, the most bizarre situation occurs where we go into the electoral arena and our principal opponents are people who agree with us on the agenda. And if they were only candid enough to say, we disagree with you because we are prisoners of a 220-year-old winner-take-all electoral college two-party duopoly, they call us the spoilers. The two parties have spoiled our government, our elections, our country, our Constitution, and they call us the spoilers. And let me tell you why I entered the electoral arena. Because starting around 1979-80, when the inflation hit and the oil prices and so on, the corporations started moving in. Naomi Klein's book is very good, Shock Doctrine. It used to be when there was real trouble in the society, there was a populist surge to curtail some of the greed of economic interest. Now it's just the opposite. When there's a crisis, the corporations become even more powerful. And so in that period, they started advancing their power. Last year of Carter and then Reagan, of course. You know, the Democrats have become very good at electing very bad Republicans for years. Gingrich, Bush, and so on. People at Truman and FDR were a landslide because they knew who they were, unlike the blurring, triangulating Democrats. But you have this situation where the doors started closing on citizen groups in Washington. These are the groups you contribute to: environmental, labor, prison reform, migrant labor, health groups, and so on. And there's something about these citizen groups. They don't like to admit they're losing power, for obvious reasons, because power, the perception of power, is the power. And year after year, they're losing more and more power. The doors are closing, except for the corporations, who can get what they want out of Congress. 1,500 of them, of the corporations, pretty much get what they want out of 535 men and women who put their shoes on every morning the way you and I do. And as we went into the 80s, the harder we tried to improve our country for those people who have no voice all over the country, the harder we tried to do something about almost 60,000 people who died from worker-related diseases and injury every year, or the 65,000 people who died from air pollution, EPA figures, or the hundreds of thousands of people who died because of hospital-induced infections, medical negligence, adverse effects of pharmaceuticals, etc., it became more and more difficult just to be heard, just to get a hearing, regardless whether it was Democrat, Republican controlled in Congress, just to get the FDA and the FAA and OSHA and EPA, all these agencies, many of which we helped create, to respond to petitions to set stronger health and safety standards and to improve enforcement so that people would live and not get sick and their children wouldn't get injured. And so we went through the 80s and then into the 90s, and then Clinton, Gore were elected. So this must be a little different. Went through the 80s where we tried to show that Mondale was better than Reagan, and Mondale's people would listen to what we were saying about how to go after Reagan, and then we'd say Dukakis better than Bush. Dukakis people. I mean, it took him until 4 days before the election when a reporter caught him in the Imperial Valley in California, and he admitted he was a liberal. Yes, I am a liberal. And that's how bad it was. The right wing has turned the word liberal into a dirty word. The way both parties have turned politics into a dirty word. But then it didn't work. And then along came Clinton and Gore, and in 8 years, corporate power got worse in Washington. Worse. In one area after another. I can tell you now, as someone who for 40 years has challenged government agencies, departments, sued them, collaborated with them, investigated with them, with hundreds and hundreds of my colleagues, that there is not one department, not one agency, from the Department of Defense to Department of Labor, that is not overwhelmingly controlled internally and externally by corporate power. Internally, they put their own executives in high appointments, secretary of this, assistant secretary of that. Externally, they have 35,000 full-time lobbyists. The drug companies have 450 full-time lobbyists just working on Congress. And did they ever get a return during the drug benefit legislation? Billions and billions of subsidies. And they have 10,000 political action committees funneling money into their coffers. So I'm saying to myself and citizen groups and colleagues, what are we doing here? What are we doing here? Are we going through a facade every morning? We get up and we batter against this ever more formidable door, closing us out? No, we either do something or we retire and go to Monterey and watch the whales while they're still around. Well, I didn't find many people agreeing with me. They kept batting their head against the door, and it wouldn't open. And so they defined victory as something less and less and less. They defined it defensively, and then if they could stop a little amendment here that was like a pigeon for other amendments to get through, like a distraction, they would say it's a big victory. Well, I like to face reality. I've never liked illusion and delusion. And Jefferson once said, when we lose our government, and have we ever lost our government, the corporations are not just influential in Washington, they are our government. Half of the government is being contracted out. You've read about the Defense Department, KBR, Halliburton, Blackwater. I mean, they're doing virtually everything but piloting the jet planes. And it's true in other departments as well. Just in the New York Times the other day, they had this KBR subsidiary of Halliburton, which had been spun off. The auditor for the Army found $1 billion in asserted payments for which there were no invoices, no records. What did you do for the $1 billion in Iraq? And he was forced to retire. And what did the Army do? The Army said KBR is indispensable. How do we feed the troops? Like the Army never fed itself, right? How do we feed the troops for 5 times as much cost as it used to be in the Army? So they contracted out the review of the contract to a private company. And the private company, of course, said they are indispensable. And KBR maintained its $1 billion. The first $9 billion in Iraq, there's no accounting for it. $700 billion of Pentagon budget is unauditable, according to the Government Accountability Project, which is the accounting arm of the U.S. Congress. That's a pretty serious thing. Every year, they render their judgment. The Pentagon budget is unauditable. That's half of the federal government's operating expenditures, unauditable. So you've got to go into electoral politics, because what else is there to do? Then go into electoral politics. Well, you say, well, you can still be active citizens. Yeah, you can. All the stuff you read in Nation magazine and The Progressive about what's wrong in America and how to make it right and all the recommendations are going nowhere if we don't break into the barrier into the electoral arena. Because if you say, for example, If you say, for example, we need campaign reform, okay? Well, let's see, public funding of public campaigns, instant runoff voting, binding none of the above, reducing ballot access obstacles to third parties so you can have a more competitive democracy. All this has to be by legislation. All this has to be done by elected officials. You can have all the editorials you want, the New York Times or Washington Post or on Democracy Now, or whatever, doesn't matter. All the great exposés we read, and we have so many more than we can use, about the infirmities of our political economy. Doesn't matter, unless you go into the electoral arena and begin opening it up so the sovereignty of the people replaces the power of giant corporations. So I entered the electoral arena. Now, everything was going very well until Al Gore won the popular vote and the Electoral College took it away from him, put it in Florida, where it was stolen from him before, during, and after Election Day, from the shenanigans in Tallahassee, Catherine Harris and Jeb Bush, all the way to the 5 Republican politicians on the Supreme Court who stopped the Florida Supreme Court from finishing their statewide recount and selected George W. Bush, president. Now, you would think that the Democrats, who should have been aware of this, and they weren't alert enough before, during, and after election, but you think they'd go after the thieves, huh? Instead, they go after the Green Party. Instead of going after the thieves, now because they didn't go after the thieves and get some real prosecutions and reform, they lost it in Ohio in 2004. And have they learned yet to get rid of the Electoral College? Have they learned yet to make sure only nonpartisan commissions count the votes and not corporations own the proprietary information for the electronic voting machines, whose executives are giving money to Bush, for example? Now, New York is a hotbed of single-issue liberals. And single-issue liberals look at the two parties and they say, you know, it's clear Democrats are better. Because if you're a single-issue gay lesbian, you're right. If you're a single-issue pro-Israeli military policies, I don't know who's right on that one, between the two parties, a little bit more later on that. If you are a Social Security purist, even though Al Gore and Joe Lieberman had other ideas to compromise Social Security, the Democrats are better on that. Cutting down trees in the federal forest, they're better, although not as good as their rhetoric. There are certain issues like that, but if you ask yourself, department by department, agency by department, what is the difference between the Democrat and Republican Party on defense? Has Hillary Clinton ever seen a weapon system she doesn't like? And Obama wants to increase the military budget, which is now bigger than all the military budgets of all the countries in the world combined outside of the U.S., and he wants to increase it. It's like we don't have enough equivalent TNT to blow up the world 300 times and make the rubble bounce. Huh? What's the difference between the Democrats and Republicans in the Treasury Department, Federal Reserve, Food and Drug Administration? Dr. Sidney Wolf pronounced the Clinton-Gore years the worst in 29 years of monitoring the Food and Drug Administration. The Auto Safety Agency that I helped start is now a consulting firm. It was under Clinton, a consulting firm to Detroit instead of a safety regulator. OSHA was shut down by Clinton. The fuel efficiency, Clinton told the auto companies in 1993, we're not going to increase the fuel efficiency standards. And 8 years, there wasn't even a standard proposed, which you're paying for now. So if you have 30, 40 issues, the deficit now, the deficit by Bush is horrendous. Clinton started to balance it, but the Democrats have gone along with Bush. Every time they fund the war in Iraq, every time they fund all of these unnecessary massive weapon systems like the F-22 and more destroyers and more nuclear subs and more bases abroad, all that's being funded by deficit spending. When the Democrats went along and didn't stop the tax cuts for the wealthy, even when they controlled the Senate, after Jeffords gave them the controlling Senator Jeffords, that's tax cuts for the wealthy. That builds up the deficit on the children and the grandchildren. And the point is, what is the flunking grade here? There will always be one party that isn't as bad as the other. As far as the kingdom can reign, there will always be one party. And if we are least worst voters, we're criticizing both parties, but one party's not as bad as the other. If we don't make demands on the least worst, let's say John Kerry, if the anti-war movement didn't take a year off in 2004 and call off their mass demonstrations, they didn't want to embarrass Kerry, who wanted to send more soldiers to Iraq and wouldn't have pulled out of Fallujah. Remember that one on the first debate? Then you basically are saying to the least worst nominee that your vote can be taken for granted because you know and they know you're not going to vote for the Republicans. And as a result, what happens is, in this tug of war with the corporate interests pulling both parties and both candidates their way, the liberals have in effect allowed their vote to be taken for granted because they're not playing hard to get, because they're desperate, and because they won't deny both parties their vote and go put it in a third party or independent column. Now, this analysis has no end point. There is no breaking point. For anybody who says to you that we can't afford another Republican Party domination, which I agree with, you want to ask them, what's your demand on the Democrats? What are you saying you want 1, 2, 3, 4 as the price of your vote? Because you don't have to signal your vote in April, May, June, July, August, September. Play hard to get, tell them. Whatever you do in the voting booth, privacy is your own business in November. Play hard to get. They don't play hard to get. Instead, they go after the third-party independent candidates whose agenda they agree with and do everything possible to undermine them, ridicule them, cut them off from the media. So this bears a little tabulation here. How many of you have heard of Eugene Debs? Okay. He once said, at the end of his career, oh, by the way, he once said, better to vote for someone you believe in and lose than vote for someone you don't believe in and win. Here in New York, you don't have to worry. You can vote your conscience in New York. There are 31 states that are not contested by either party because one party or the other dominates. And New York, obviously, is not contested at the presidential level. But here's what he said. Some reporter came up to him at the end of his career and he said, Mr. Debs, what's your greatest regret? And Debs looked at him and responded this way. He said, my greatest regret? My greatest regret is that under the Constitution, the American people can have almost anything they want, but they don't seem to want much of anything at all. Now, let me give you an example. 1945, Europe is in rubble. The U.S. is the colossus, militarily, technologically, economically. In Western Europe, out of the rubble, the people, directly or through their intermediate institutions like trade unions, demanded full health insurance. They got it. They demanded a living wage. They got it. They demanded a decent pension, and they got it by law. By law. They demanded paid maternity leave, and they got it. They demanded paid family sick leave, and they got it. They demanded 4 weeks paid vacation by law, and they got it. They demanded decent daycare, and they got it. They demanded reasonable public transit, and they got it by law. We don't have any of that by law. None of it. We don't have paid vacations by law. We don't have any of it by law. That's the difference between expectation levels out of desperation and rubble for a better life and a two-party elected dictatorship that prevented new entries, new energies, new agendas, and new candidates on the ballot line at all levels of election, federal, state, and local. We have to raise our expectation level. We do not have a democracy in the following areas. Majority of the people and physicians want single payer, full health insurance, which gives you your free choice of doctor and hospital, cuts out $500 billion of billing fraud and administrative expenses every year, and allows outcomes analysis through collecting data through a single payer. The HMOs, drug companies, and health insurance companies say no. The politicians year after year go along with them. The people say yes. The people lose. No democracy there. Living wage, an enormous consensus of the American population. If you work full-time, you should be able to pay for the necessities for your family. The living wage in this country is a mockery. By January of 2009, it'll hit $7.25, although New York has a little higher one. If it was indexed to inflation from 1968, it would be $10 today. So it's losing ground in purchasing power of groceries and so on, and not keeping up, even though productivity per worker since 1968 has doubled. Where are all the gains going? To the top 5, 1/10%, and to the corporate interests. Okay, so McDonald's and Burger King and Walmart say no to a living wage. The people say yes. McDonald's, Burger King, and Walmart get the politicians on their side to say no, and the people lose. No democracy there. Cracking down on corporate crime, fraud, and abuse. Trillions of dollars of looted, environmental crimes, consumer rip-offs. You've been the victim of more than a few of these things. There's very, very little enforcement. If you took a poll, it'd be overwhelming. Demand for more prosecutorial resources, tougher penalties, and stronger criminal laws. The corporate criminals say no. They fund the politicians to side with them. The people say yes. The people lose. No democracy there. The pollution is the same thing. You get polls now where they say, will you pay more to have cleaner air and cleaner water? Not do you like cleaner air and cleaner water. It comes in about 80%. The polluters say no. They fund the politicians side with them. The people say yes. They lose. Not much democracy there. Pollution is a cumulative form of violence. Corporate welfare. There's one people don't like. There wouldn't have been a stadium built in the country with tax dollars if it was up to referendums with equal information. And yet, they're built all over the country while schools, clinics, libraries, public works crumbling for lack of repair funding. Solar energy against nuclear power. Not a chance in the public opinion polls. Overwhelming support for all kinds of solar energy, heavy opposition to nuclear power. Nuclear power is now on the table for Obama and McCain, and they want to subsidize the nuclear plants with 100% loan guarantee from Uncle Sam. The nuclear industry will not build a single nuclear plant and get financing from Wall Street unless they have 100% loan guarantee from you, the taxpayer. So much for capitalism. At 7, the global trade treaties. Long opposition to those, even though overwhelmingly the propaganda is on the side of these WTO, NAFTA trade agreements. And we're losing jobs, and it's not doing Mexico any good. It's basically a way to let fascist and communist dictators abroad to be staging grounds for US factories and jobs to be shipped there to bring down standards of living here. Because you can't compete with 50-cent hard-working labor in China with brand new capital equipment and the full support of US corporations shipping these products back here. This is not comparative advantage, this is absolute advantage. There is no free trade possible with dictatorships because dictators determine costs, they determine labor costs, they destroy attempts to form independent labor unions. So once again, no democracy there. Same with the military budget. And how about foreign and military affairs? What kind of democracy is there? I'll take it one that's usually considered sensitive here, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Here we have AIPAC listening to McCain and Obama pander to them to such a degree that they could substitute automated mannequins to give the speeches for them. AIPAC does not represent majority Jewish American opinion. Poll after poll of Jewish Americans, Arab Americans as well, want a two-state solution. AIPAC does not represent a lot of opinion in Israel. For example, AIPAC is for the cruel, inhuman blockade of 1.5 million people in Gaza, where medicine, fuel, electricity, drinking water, food are being withheld. And so Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, just took a poll. March 1st, it was delivered. Haaretz is a leading newspaper in Israel. 64% of Israelis want direct negotiation with Hamas. So you got Obama and Clinton, Obama, Clinton, and McCain. They are on to the right of public opinion in Israel. Only 28% say no. Among the 60%, 64% are former generals, national security officials, etc. As we just heard in the last 2 days that they're negotiating a ceasefire between the two parties. It is far freer to discuss this issue in the Knesset and in Israel than it is in the Congress and in the United States. Why? Not representing the national interests of this country, not representing Jewish American predominant opinion. It represents a highly organized type of lobby, of which we're familiar with in other areas like NRA and so on, that carries the day in Congress. And it's largely citizen action. Say what you say about AIPAC or NRA, it's citizen action. It teaches us what citizens can get in Washington if they organize in all kinds of ways. But if we continue to grow up corporate and not think for ourselves in our schools, we don't teach civic skills in our schools, we teach children to believe and not to think, then millions of people grow up and they don't even know what they own as a commonwealth. The people own the public airways, the public lands, the public research and development, they own the labor pensions, but the corporations control all of these. This is the biggest wealth in the United States. If the people controlled what they own, the political system would be considerably different in terms of what it delivers for the people instead of what it surrenders to the corporations. The idea that corporations, which are artificial entities, have equal rights with us under the Constitution is never taught in the schools. I wasn't even taught it in law school. How can an artificial entity have all the constitutional rights you have, plus all the privileges, immunities, and huge power concentration that corporations are capable of, that no individual can come close to, and still say we live in a society of equal justice under law? Do you really live in a society of equal justice under law between you and Exxon, or Pfizer, or Citibank? Of course not. But it isn't even discussed in political campaigns. What are political campaigns supposed to discuss? Power, the distribution of power. Who has it? Who doesn't have it? Who has too much of it? Who should have more of it? That's what we should be discussing. And above all, we should discuss the solutions. We should constantly hammer the derelictions in our society with the available, practical, realizable solutions. Many of them in pilot projects all over the country. The solarized office building, the inner city school that works beautifully, the mayor who's actually doing a great job. Why? The technology that is allowing organic farmers to make a profit, called rediscovering old knowledge technology. We're not seeing that. And in this campaign, I've got 3 suggestions for the people that no one can stop them from doing. Forming coalitions in every city that the candidates are going through, say the Urban League, unions, neighborhood organizations, consumer groups, environmental groups, housing groups, health groups, civil rights groups, they all get together and they invite the candidates to their city. And they say, we're going to hire an auditorium, and we're going to present our agenda, and we're going to ask you a lot of questions. And if you want to ask us a lot of questions, that's fine. And all the press will be observers, not participants. They'll line the walls with their cameras and microphones and scratch pads. What can stop us from doing that? What can stop us from turning the dynamic of the election from being spectators to being participants and agitators? There's nothing can stop us from that. Half of democracy is showing up. They can't stop us from showing up. If they do, there's another level of activity that ensues. Nothing can stop us of doing that. And that should be done. The second is that nothing can stop us from getting together. Let's say you have a disheartened Democrat and a disheartened Republican. And they're having coffee. And they say, they're disheartened Democrats, but they don't want to vote for the Republican. Disheartened Republicans, they don't want to vote for the Democrat. What can they do? What they can do is right in front, they just fill out the absentee and vote for Nader Gonzalez. That way, there's no such thing. There's no such thing. You see, this is not vote swapping. This is basically taking one vote away from Republican, one vote away from Democrat, and putting it into a progressive slot. Nothing can stop people from doing that. With the internet, it can spread like crazy. We all work with people who are on the other side of the fence, right? We have neighbors, we have friends, Republican, Democrat, and they're all harping about their parties. The Ron Paul people and the Libertarians don't like the corporate welfare and the Patriot Act, etc., and the war-mongering of Bush. And the Democrats, they don't like the idea of taking impeachment off the table and funding the war and not doing anything about public works and going along with corporate tax shelters and so on. And that's the way you can spread this kind of thing. Now there's a website that explains this all to you. It's called votepact.org, votepact, P-A-C-T.org. And with the internet, it could spread very, very rapidly. It's personal, it's political, you've got your own domain, you can have a vote of conscience without feeling like you're helping the dreaded other party that you don't want to get a vote on. Finally, and in this way, I think it's important to conclude in this way. How many of you would be interested in being part of a Congress watchdog lobby with the following commitment? Let's see, now it's a series. Say an equivalent 5 hours volunteering a week. This is all coordinated with a full-time staff and contributing $200 a year for the staff, for the expenses in your congressional district, assuming a platform was placed right in front of you. All these long overdue things like single payer and the bloated military budget being cut and energy and housing and public transit. So all the deferred maintenance, let's put it that way, and the deferred attention to our problems. Nothing really Buck Rogers, nothing 22nd century, nothing pie in the sky. Just what a lot of what Western Europe has, for example. How many of you are willing to do, let's say, 5 hours a week on the average, $200 a year raise or contribute, and to be a part of a 2,000 citizen core, Congress Watch lobby in each congressional district? Now, you see, isn't this a testament to our lack of organization? All of us? And do you know what Saul Alinsky once said, the great organizer in Chicago? He said, the only way to defeat organized money is with organized people. And it's true now as it ever was. I want to thank the volunteers. Who are the volunteers? They deserve a hand for making this come together. And for those of you who want more information, who want to help us with our ballot access drive in New York, it takes 15,000 or so valid signatures, which means 30,000 signatures we have to collect because They disqualify some in about a 2-month period. So we need people who are willing to get 10 signatures, 20, 30, 40, 100, starting June 26th, and out there you can get the relevant materials. That's what we're doing now. We're getting on the ballot in state after state, and some of the obstacles are horrendous. Nowhere in Canada or Western Europe do you have these kinds of barriers. And second, it would be good if you had any technical skills, computer skills, graphic arts skills, whatever skills you think you could help us with in whatever amount of time. And third, if you have any good suggestions on how to arouse the public, I mean really arouse the public, that would be good. And okay. And before I come back for a discussion, I want to introduce two young organizers. One of the reasons I ran for elective office because I want to help attract a whole generation of young people who don't look at politics as a dirty word, look at it as what it was in ancient Athens, as an antidote to autocracy. And so they can get skilled and trained and motivated to go into the electoral arena and to organize. We go around the country and we have people say, you know, I became mayor of Richmond, California, 110,000 people because I was a volunteer in your campaign in 2000. Or I became a mayor of Greenwich, New York, the village, because I heard you mention an ancient Chinese proverb, which, by the way, is to know and not to do is not to know. To know and not to do is not to know. And he went home and he was having dreams and nightmares. And he says, what do I know that I'm not doing? And he decided, I know how to run for office. And first time he ran for office and he won 74% of the vote. He's now mayor of Greenwich, New York. So there are a lot of spin-offs in this kind of campaigns and a lot of momentum for the future. After all, no movement that doesn't encourage and motivate and enlist the young is ever going to last very long. And that's why you go to a lot of labor conventions and there aren't a lot many young people. You go to a lot of co-op meetings and there are not all that many young people. Too many young people are watching screens, 50, 60 hours of screens, television, video, internet. They're in virtual reality, not reality. And we haven't begun to add up the price from that immersion.